Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And today I actually watched something on Shudder that was recommended to me, and it's a little anthology film called Scare Package. And this is it's touted as a seven-segment anthology. It's really a six-segment, and I'll kind of explain that. But basically, there are two stories in it that kind of frame everything else. So I'm going to go over those two stories last, and it's the first story and the last story. And like I said, they're connected. But I want to go over the middle entries first because those are not really connected, and I can judge them on their own as opposed to judging them as an overarching narrative. So the first one, it takes place in the woods. It appears immediately after the opening segment, which is actually just called Cold Opening. And it's called One Time in the Woods. And basically, this is the entirety of this film is kind of it's an homage to horror in the meta sense. It's almost like taking Scream, but taking Scream to scary movie levels. It feels a bit more on the scary movie side than the Scream side, but the effects are still actually fairly good for most of the segments, including this one. And basically, I don't really have much of a problem with this one. Now, this is actually one of my more favorite ones out of the segments that were done. And basically, the idea is there's this looks like a bunch of quote unquote teenagers. Again, it's probably people in their late 20s, but they're off in the woods. There's a fat guy, a couple of women, and this kind of weird like alternative guy, I guess, something like that, or a hipster or something along those lines. But basically, this other guy shows up at the camp and he basically says he's going to turn into a monster and murder them unless they kill him. And then he starts going through this horribly grotesque transformation. Again, it reminds me a lot of something like Dead Alive in terms of the splat stick humor. But he starts to like go through this grotesque transformation, and then suddenly, hipster guy puts a pair of handcuffs on him, and he proceeds to melt into the ground. I'm assuming he was some kind of a werewolf. I don't remember if they explicitly state that in the scene. But I'm assuming so, since they say it's literally he has silver handcuffs, and basically they think it's like a kink thing, and in reality, apparently he is some serial killer who's been wandering around in the woods, and he then proceeds to brutally murder everybody except for the one redhead that kind of liked him. And at one point, he impales his head on a tomahawk, which is actually a really, really funny effect when it's done. Um, but after that, it's just the redheaded girl and the pile of mush that used to be the werewolf guy, because apparently he's still alive. So what winds up happening is that she proceeds to he tries to basically get her to like push him back together because he's actually turned into like a pile of goop. So she wants him to kind of push the goop back, or he wants her to kind of push the goop back together. So when he forms back into a person, he's not missing a part of himself, which I guess is kind of an interesting little way to explain it. He then proceeds to bite her, and she handcuffs herself to the silver handcuffs. So now she's a werewolf or something like that, and she also melts into a pile next to him, and then it ends. I know I kind of went over that whole thing, but the the plot of it I like. It's very small. You don't really need to have too much of stuff make sense. You just need to make it believable that this guy is turning into a monster, which they do. And then the rest of it is just kind of jumbled in there. That's the only kind of, well, not the only, but one of the problems I kind of have with this movie is that the meta stuff kind of it wears on you after a while, especially when you get to the last segment in the film. Um, but let's move on from One Time in the Woods and let's go into the next segment, which is called Mister. And this is kind of a weird one. This is a segment where basically the idea is that it's kind of a bait and switch, or it's a heel turn one. So you think that there's this mild mannered guy. He's having problems with his wife. He meets these random guys in this sort of like basement group. They all seem to be all cartoonishly masculine. And what winds up happening is that he goes back. It turns out, I guess they're werewolves. He murders them, but then the twist comes where you think like when he kills them, you think like okay, this is. At first, when he goes there, you think they're going to murder the shit out of him because you can kind of see what's coming in a sense. But then after you get past that, then he kills all of them. Brutally kills all of them and brings home their pelts to his wife, who they then sacrifice in some kind of like a satanic ritual with a pentagram on the floor. Well, they don't sacrifice the wife, but they use the werewolf skin or something for it. But It's a very strange segment. I don't think you need the twist. I think the twist is enough. I think the twist that's enough is that he's a werewolf hunter or something along those lines. I think that works um, in terms of what you're trying to do with that scene. I don't think you need to carry it. I think it carried on a bit too long. Ultimately, though, I didn't mind it. Some of the effects are extremely goofy. You could tell that basically one of the werewolf characters pretty much did not they didn't have any makeup left, so they just gave him like pointy werewolf ears, and he was like sniffing and growling. And I'm not 100% sure if that's that fat kid who was the who was the catcher in the Sandlot. It kind of looks like him. um, but that one has problems, but I do kind of like it. I think it is a bit interesting. Now the next one I think is one of the weakest ones in this, and it's called Girls' Night Out of Body. And the problem that I kind of have with this one is that when you go through the story, so the idea is that these three girls are going on some kind of a vacation. They rented this like room out in the country or something like that. I don't know if they're in a motel or a hotel. You can't really tell. And basically, they went to the store, and one of the girls proceeded to steal this skull-shaped lollipop, and so they start to eat it. And immediately, two of the girls, their faces turn into skulls, almost like a Day of the Dead, that type of thing, celebration. It looks like kind of like a mask, but I guess it's grafted to their face. And it's like their face is like permanently changed or something. And then, but they have this whole subplot where it's almost like a giallo, where you see this guy who, and it's obviously kind of a homage to that idea, or at least something like Blood and Black Lace or something along those lines, where it's a guy in a trench coat with a black gloves on, and he has a knife and stuff like that. And basically, when he's getting ready to move in on him, they pull him in and then proceed to murder him in their room. But none of this is ever really explained what the lollipop is supposed to do. Like I understand that it turns them into some kind of like skull-faced demons or something. But there's never really any kind of buildup. You don't understand why somebody's chasing them, other than maybe the fact that they're just, a group of three women. Again, it kind of lines up a little bit with the giallo theme, with the a lot of women die in giallos. But other than that, it feels like there's just kind of two aesthetics that are meeting there, with the Italian and the Mexican aesthetics, and they don't really mesh very well. I think if you had done like a straight either one or the other, like a straight homage to giallo, or a straight homage to, or go the other way and make it just straight about some kind of Day of the Dead type of celebration or something like that, that would make a bit more sense. I think that meshing the two together, I think ultimately ruins the short, in terms of trying to apply a narrative, or trying to apply like a homage to it, because you can't really tell like what they're homaging, because the mixing is so strange. But then after we move through that one, then we go into So Much to Do. Now this, I think, is one of the lower ones on here, because this one is just, there's never any kind of explanation given to what's going on, essentially. So you have this guy who is he's running around in the woods, and he basically says, there's so much to do, and he starts screaming about it. You don't really understand what's going on. These two other guys in black trench coats then burn an omega symbol into his forehead. Again, that is never explained. Then they bury him alive, and then it looks like his soul rises up from the ground in kind of a corny effect, and proceeds to inhabit this random woman who's parked in her car nearby. The guy then goes home and inside this woman's body, and proceeds to watch television, where she attacks him in her brain, and proceeds to beat the shit out of him enough to get him out of her body, because she doesn't want to hear spoilers to a television show. And then I think it's something along like Wizard versus Wizard or something like that. So I think they're supposed to be magical beings, but again, none of that is ever explained. We're just kind of fed visuals in this scene that don't really make a lot of sense. And then I think at the end of it, the two guys in the black trench coats are shown like stalking the woman or something like that. Again, not a lot of it makes sense. That one to me, like from beginning to end, there are so many. If you had stretched that out to maybe like a 20-minute segment, I think it was probably maybe 15, if that. I think you could have added a lot more to it and given us a lot more context, and I think it would have made it a better scene. Now I know they couldn't have done that because of because of the time frame that they had to work with in terms of trying to fit all these shorts into one movie. Maybe instead of doing all of them, cut it in half, make them a little bit longer, make them better. And then you go into, actually, sorry, that was the second to last one. There is actually one before that that I kind of missed, which is The Night He Came Back Again, Part 4, The Final Kill, which is basically, it's all of it is some kind of a spoof on the idea of like the slasher villain coming back from the dead all the time. And basically, there's this one girl who's considered the quote unquote final girl, and this killer keeps coming back and killing all of her boyfriends. So they capture him at the very beginning of the short, and they tie him down, and then they proceed to murder him in various ways. Although every other person in the little circle of friends gets brutally murdered somehow trying to do this, until it's literally only the girl left, and then she shoves him through a wood chipper, where he explains that he's actually her brother. Again, probably a spoof or a homage to Halloween, which there's a few of those in here. Actually, some that kind of don't make sense. Friday the 13th as well has a few of them. I don't know if they had any from Nightmare on Elm Street, if I remember correctly. Maybe they did, but that one is very comedic. I get what it's spoofing. It doesn't go overly insane with it, and the ending is gratuitous and funny when she's shoving the guy into the wood chipper. It's pretty fucking insane. Now, the last thing I'm going to go over is the beginning and the end of this, which is basically there's an interlay, there's a background story to all of these little things. Where at the beginning of the story we meet this guy who kind of looks like he looks like a creepy dude. He's kind of a weird, creepy guy, and he kind of explains that he does this job for movies, but we don't really understand what it is. And he gets these little pieces of paper that tell him to go do certain things, and then after he does those certain things, he's supposed to leave, and something is supposed to happen. At one point, he has this encounter with these two women that basically he accidentally murders, or one of them accidentally kills herself, and then he accidentally stabs the other one. And again, it's played up for comedy. It's slapstick comedy. And it's extremely bloody. The gore effects in this movie are actually very, very good. He then proceeds to basically dress himself up like Michael Myers and cover himself in blood, and then his friend, who apparently either plays or is a police officer, has to bring him in and arrest him or something. The beginning and end of this make almost no. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say that. The beginning of this makes almost no sense. Because you're not really sure what they're trying to spoof. It's just that this guy apparently does all these things so that horror villains can do things. I'm not even 100% sure. It's very, very weird, the opening to this film. Now, after that, we meet this guy called Rad Chad. And Rad Chad is basically, he's this over-the-top kind of horror guy. He owns a video store that specifically caters to horror fans, or at least it seems like it does. And he has kind of a Bill Hader stand-in that comes in there and kind of acts like an asshole and constantly tries to get a job, even though Chad turns him down because he doesn't like him. He then proceeds to hire another guy named Han, who comes in and is apparently a fairly good employee. And that's where all the anthologies come from, is they basically start popping these videos in at different points during their time in the store, until the end of the movie. Now, the end of the movie basically has Han pick up a video rewinding device and smack Rad Chad in the back of the head. He then wakes up in a chamber with a bunch of other people that match up with the horror tropes that you normally would associate with a general slasher film. You have the jock, the stoner, the whore, the final girl, the kind of older mom type woman, and then you also have the horror nerd, which is basically the Rad Chad character. Now, this is where the movie falls apart for me. Like, literally falls apart. Like, I can get past some of the segments not necessarily being, entirely fleshed out, given the amount of segments that are in the film. But the last almost 30 minutes of the movie is basically taken up by this long kind of segment that's supposed to be kind of a homage to a bunch of horror things, but it just kind of, it loosely fits together in any form of a narrative. It's almost like, hey, look at this, you remember this? Hey, look at this, you remember this? Hey, look at this, you remember this? It's kind of like, okay, I can discern all these things, but I don't understand why they're there. Like, I get that you're trying to spoof something, but it's one of those things where it's a joke a minute, so you don't even really have time to let one sink in before another one shows up. And basically, they then proceed to go on a massive killing spree with this basically like a Leatherface style killer who's running through this like maze, just murdering people inside of this hospital building. He murders Rad Chad. Joe Bob Briggs has a cameo in this for whatever reason. I'm assuming it's because it was going to Shudder, so they offered him a part in it. It feels because it was on his show, it feels almost like shameless, shameless product placement. And then he's brutally murdered like 5 minutes later. So it's like, okay, I don't really understand why he was here. Rad Chad also gets killed, and then at the end of the movie, you have the guy that comes back from the beginning, the one that kind of sets up all the horror scenarios, and he proceeds to blow up the Leatherface stand-in in a car. They also have a callback to Friday the 13th Part 4, where a guy basically is dressed up kind of like Corey Feldman to try and do the same thing, which, again, does not really make a whole lot of sense, given that the killer he's dealing with is not Jason Voorhees. So it's a bit odd. It doesn't work very well, I think, with the rest of the film. I would have felt better if maybe you had trimmed that off almost completely and instead extended some of these anthologies to include more stuff to make them make more sense. And at the same time, I think you could have set this up for a sequel as well if you wanted to do it, where you could have this video store continue on with these three characters, because they were kind of funny the way that they worked together. I actually like the in-betweens. I think it was actually a very good way to kind of get out and get into all these different scenario or all these different segments. So I would have liked to have seen that, maybe a la Creep Show, something like that, where you return to this video store in the second film and you watch more anthologies. I thought that would have been a great idea, but instead they chose to kill off pretty much all the characters, and the ending is kind of just all over the place. So really, the framing stories are really what I have more of a problem with than the individual films. And I know it sounds like I'm bashing this movie a lot, but it is legitimately funny in a lot of portions of it, especially that first skit. And there's a lot of other ones that have very funny moments in them. They're very goofy. Again, if you're a horror fan, you're going to get all of the Easter eggs that are in the movies, or at least most of them. They're all pretty obvious and pretty mainstream for the most part if you're a horror fan. So you'll probably get most of them. But aside from that, I don't know how high I can actually rate this. If I'm going to rate it out of, let's say if I was going to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd probably give it a solid 6.5 or 7. I think it's a little above average with the effects. And some of the segments really honestly do stand out, like like the first one does. So I would give it credit for that, but at the same time, it gets dragged down a little bit by some of these segments that don't make a lot of sense, and the gratuitous end segment that really probably shouldn't have even been there. So, like I said, I'd give it a 7. If you're a fan of anthologies, I'd say give it a watch. Maybe turn it off before the end of it, because again, the ending's kind of stupid, even though it does have some good gore effects in it. I'd like to know, but that's my opinion. I'd like to know what you think. If you've seen this film, either on Shudder or when it had its limited release last October, I'd like to know what you think. Put your thoughts in the comments below as usual. Hit the bell for notifications. Hit the like button. Subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?